Hello and welcome to the Autism Basics Professional Development. Hopefully you will, learn something new about autism today and maybe take some knowledge back to your classroom that can help your students be as successful as possible. So for today's learning objectives, we'll talk about the key aspects of autism, also known as ASD or autism spectrum disorder, define some diagnostic criteria for it and some terminology, look at some causes and characteristics of autism, identify some strategies for collaboration, both with professionals who may work with your students and parents as well, and also talk about person-centered planning in regards to your students with autism. So we'll go ahead and keep going. So what is autism spectrum disorder? So it is a developmental disability that can result in significant delays in developmental differences in how a person may communicate or interact with others. Your students may have a hard time talking with their peers, understanding maybe like social cues or facial expressions, or even showing an interest in those around them. Some students may engage in repetitive behaviors, such as maybe flapping their hands, rocking back and forth, repeating words or phrases. Some of them will have some very intense and specific interests, and even abnormal reactions to like sensory experiences such as like loud noises. Um, One important thing to always remember, though, is that no two people with autism are the same, hence why we call it a spectrum. And, over the years, a lot of people who have been defined as having autism spectrum disorder has also drastically changed. So back in like 89, uh, 70s, 80s, it was like 1 in 10,000 people who were identified with autism. But, Q today, and it's closer to 1 in 31 people, which is um, a drastic increase. And as you can see from the graphic, even just since the year 2000, it has increased 384%, which sounds like a lot, and it is. Um, but we'll talk more about how it is diagnosed later. So some important things to know in regards to terms you might hear with autism or ASD include neurodivergent, stimming, echolalia, meltdown, and this one is not just for autism but for all disabilities, is IDEA. So touching on the first one, people who are neurodivergent, um, I'm sure you have probably heard many people talking about this term, especially in the recent years. But neurodivergent is just a non-medical term that describes people whose brains develop or work differently for some reason. So this means that the person has different strengths and struggles from those people whose brains develop more typically. So while some people who are neurodivergent may also have medical conditions, it also happens to people where a medical condition or diagnosis may have not yet been defined or identified. So that's for neurodivergent. So next we'll talk about stimming. So, show of hands on the camera. Who has ever been nervous or maybe upset about something, and maybe you found yourself like doing something like wringing your hands or like twirling your hair or even shaking your leg, tapping your foot. I know I have. All of these things are, those actually can be classified as stimming. So stimming just refers to the self-regulatory, self-stimulatory behaviors, which provide a way for individuals to self-regulate in order to deal with maybe their emotions or even sensory input, or even just to process the world around them. So it can include repetitive movements or vocalizations, And while most commonly associated with ASD, autism spectrum disorder, you can also see it in other individuals too, such as those with maybe anxiety or ADHD, or, even anyone could just do it, but it's not strictly an autism only thing. Echolalia. So that is the precise repetition or echoing aloud of maybe words, sounds, sentences, phrases, and can present in different ways. So when someone is directly repeating, or maybe you might say parroting, something that they hear, that's classified as immediate echolalia. So if you were to say to a student, do you need to use the bathroom? And they may repeat to you immediately, do you need to use the bathroom? That is immediate echolalia. Now, if someone were to be repeating words or phrases such as maybe lines from their favorite movie or TV show or from a song they're familiar with, but it's not immediately after the fact, it's like at a later time, and a lot of times even quite out of context, that's more of a delayed echolalia. Um, and sometimes it's done as a form of stimming, but sometimes it's also a form of communication. And students will also even use it to like process their thoughts about what's going on. I'm sorry, there's a bug. Oh, go away. Okay, sorry. Um, so meltdowns, that is something that a lot of people have heard when it comes to autism. So meltdowns are not the same thing as a tantrum. So a tantrum is like your traditional emotional outburst, um, with a specific goal or function behind that tantrum. And it is more of a learned behavioral response, um, used in order to obtain a specific outcome. So, like, maybe a child does not want to do an activity or some of their classwork, or maybe they really want a toy. So maybe I know some of you probably have, little ones at home. So, maybe they're at daycare and they see one of their friends has the truck, but they want the truck. So they're going to start throwing a fit because they want the truck. That would be a tantrum. Outbursts for tantrums, they happen deliberately, and the individual maintains control of their body and mind the whole time. And they generally stop after the desired outcome happens. So recovery is pretty instant. Whereas with meltdowns, they are not necessarily behavioral responses and generally aren't used to achieve a certain outcome. This is more so as a reaction that is involuntary and can't really be controlled, because the intense emotions take over. And once individuals have reached that state of mind for a meltdown, they cannot usually stop and respond to standard behavioral calming cues or techniques. And it can be a longer time before the meltdown has stopped and they're able to be more calm and, get back to what they need to be doing. Um, so lastly, I bring up the term IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, also known as IDEA. And it is a law, a federal law, that makes available a free and appropriate public education to eligible children with disabilities throughout the entire nation, so every single state, and ensures special education and its related services are able to be delivered to these children. And this law outlines what is defined as a disability and what is able for a child to be able to receive services. And so if a child has a suspected disability that is covered under IDEA, then that's when a child could be tested to see if it educationally is impacting them. And then if it is impacting them educationally, then um, they could qualify for services. Now, if it does not impact them educationally, that's when maybe you would go down different routes. But we're not going to cover those routes right now because we're just focusing on autism. All right. So, how is autism, ASD, diagnosed? So there's really two ways that it's diagnosed. A lot of kids will have a medical diagnosis, and that's done by a doctor or a licensed physician or psychologist. And they use what's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And the little short acronym is DSM-5. So that's the current version we're on. And in the DSM-5, the diagnosis is specifically labeled autism spectrum disorder, and that's where ASD comes from for that little acronym. Um, but, more so for our purposes, we're going to be more talking about the educational side of things. So, as far as an educational determination, it is made by a multidisciplinary team based on the regulations, like I said, from IDEA to see do they qualify, do they not. Um, and an educational determination is required for you to access educational services. And you'll notice the difference is another difference is that the eligibility determination is just autism. It is not autism spectrum disorder, it's just autism. Um, So again, because the medical system relies on the DSM-5 for diagnosis, like I said, it usually uses the term ASD, and then education uses autism. Regardless of what specialists call the disorder, it is the child's unique needs that are important. Um, and autism often begins with kids before the age of 3 and can last throughout it will last throughout the person's life. Autism doesn't just go away, just like any other disability. And although symptoms may change over the time, so they may have more or less needs as they grow and as they develop. So some kids may show signs and symptoms of autism spectrum disorder within the first like 12 months of their life, but with some people it can show up later, maybe not until they're maybe like 2 or later. And it can also be diagnosed in adults. And it's a little bit more tricky, but it does happen. So as I said, as far as like educational diagnosing of autism, um, if the child has a medical diagnosis already of autism, then parents will definitely be encouraged to come to their local school district, sometimes known as a local education agency, and talk with that school about what, if any, services may or may not be provided educationally for their child. Now, in addition to those who do already have a medical diagnosis, sometimes there's kids who fall through the cracks because I mean, remember how I said that adults can also be identified? Sometimes older kids, a kid might be older before they are actually diagnosed. So um, sometimes you may have a suspicion that a child has autism, and so that that child can be referred and assessed by the multidisciplinary team, which again is just professionals such as like your diagnostician, your speech therapist, any other people who need to observe or assess the child, etc. And they will come together, bring all of their information, and assess that child across multiple areas to determine if they do or do not actually qualify for services as a student with autism. So the multidisciplinary team will interview the parents, they'll interview teachers, the student, and they'll review any important academic or home information that is relevant to the diagnosis process. And then they'll also conduct observations of the child to see like what the behavior looks like. And also the assessments will include academic achievement and ability assessments to see, again, does this disability impact the child's academic performance and achievement? And if it does, then they would meet the criteria under IDEA for autism. Um, Another thing that's important to remember is that while a child may have a diagnosis medically of autism spectrum disorder, that does not automatically guarantee or qualify them for services under IDEA because, and I've said this a bunch of times, I'm probably going to still say it more, they have to qualify educationally. If it's not impacting their school day and they're, getting everything they need, they're keeping up with their schoolwork, they're not falling behind, and they don't need really any supports, then they're not going to qualify for services. Um, One thing I like to remind parents and teachers about is that um, you wouldn't give a child medicine ahead of a illness because that doesn't really serve a purpose. Um, and same thing with um, the qualifications for services. You wouldn't just give them services just because they may have a disability. They have to show the need as well. Often they do, but it's just something to remember. So now we're going to take a moment and we'll kind of discuss like some of the causes of autism. So while many risk factors have been identified that may make a child more likely to have autism, there is no necessarily one singular cause. So things like their environment, their biological makeup, their genetic factors, all of those can play a part and factor into whether or not they may develop autism spectrum disorder. Um, so, there are also a few things that might make a child more likely to develop autism, such as maybe they have a sibling or other, direct family member, like a parent who has autism. Some kids who have certain chromosomal conditions may be more likely to develop autism, and those who experience birth complications, and even being born to parents who are of an older age. Um, and so those are just some things that, can play a part in whether or not someone develops it. A big thing over the last, I'd say few decades is people were questioning if vaccines were causing autism, and that is actually a myth and has been debunked. Many, many studies have looked at whether there is a relationship between vaccines and autism spectrum disorder, and to date, the studies continue to show that the vaccines are not associated with autism spectrum disorder. So, if that was in your brain, pluck it out and throw it away because they're not correlated with each other. So, some common and classic core characteristics of autism may include several things. So, a lot of kids will have difficulty with social interactions, like with their peers and other adults. They'll have a harder time making and maintaining friendships and relationships with others. They also may display repetitive behaviors such as like the stimming, and can have a difficult time communicating with others as well. And many individuals with autism are also very sensitive to sensory input, such as like noises or textures of maybe like their clothing or even like food. Um, and so that can be a trigger for some of our kiddos. However, many of our students, we have to remember, that even though they may have autism, they also do have their own unique strengths, such as maybe some have a really good memory or have strong attention to details, intense focus. So just keep that in mind that, while they may present their strengths differently, they do still have them. And, we can use those strengths to help us help them be as successful as possible. Um, Another thing to remember, it is referred to as a spectrum disorder because children with autism spectrum disorder do demonstrate a wide range of strengths and abilities and areas of need. One common phrase that I have heard countless times, and very important to remember, is that if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. That is to say that every single person that you meet that has autism is going to be very different from the next, as each person will have their own unique support needs as well as strengths. So it's important to remember that autism is definitely not a black and white diagnosis or disorder. Um, and support needs will range um, or will vary in their range from day to day, not only from person to person, but like within the person themselves. So someone may have, you know, a day where they're fine with the TV volume being at 30, and then maybe the very next day, maybe they were grumpy and maybe they didn't sleep well, or maybe they weren't feeling good, or maybe something else was bothering them. And so maybe that TV volume, it's bothering them today. So we just have to remember that accommodations and supports are vital to ensure that success of our students and should be individualized according to their specific needs and listed in their IEP if they're qualified for services. So I like this little graphic. So this top portion kind of shows it being more linear. So it's not necessarily someone's very autistic or just a little bit autistic, but rather that, you know, um, all people with autism are all autistic and they have different strengths and difficulties that can affect them person to person and also every day, like I said. So I just thought this was a cute little graphic. Um, anyway, so next step, parent and professional collaboration. So really the foundation of a good team starts with your communication and collaboration. And it's not only with, the professionals that you work with, but it's also with the parents and even the student. And it's imperative that us as teachers respect and communicate with the parents of the students who have autism or, any student really, but especially ones with autism. And one thing I always try to remember is that our students are our parents' most precious treasures, and they are the expert and have the most in-depth knowledge and expertise on their child. So it's always great to build that rapport, build that relationship with those parents, because then you can collaborate together. Not only to make sure your student is successful at school and that the parent has input, but also maybe you have some strategies to help them at home as well. Um, and when we work together with the parents, we can ensure that we set their child up for success. Collaboration, of course, like I said, it's not only limited to the classroom teacher. This will involve other professionals as well, such as those mentioned before, like different therapists. Like you'll have your speech therapists, you have behavior specialists, of course, the special education teacher if that child has qualified for services. Um, or even if you have a child that's maybe you suspect, talk to that special education teacher. They may have some suggestions for you that you can use in the meantime while you're trying to figure out does that student have autism or not. Um, so when all of the people, come together and collaborate well, and just form that really good team, they can create consistency and holistic support for the students across that student's environments. So that's a really good thing to remember is we got to really work together. So, when working with students with autism spectrum disorder, it's important to keep our plans for them person-centered, because you know, an IEP is an individualized education plan. So it is a plan specifically built around that student and their needs. That is a person-centered plan. And it can focus on the student's strengths, their needs academically and otherwise, and also personal preferences, um, to make sure they're set up for success. So the team that, plans for this child should include the student, the family members of the student, and any professionals who will work with the student, again, such as their teachers, their special ed case manager or teacher, any therapists who work with them. Um, and even as young children, the student themselves, they can participate in their own like IEP or behavior planning or educational planning. So a common thing that can be given to students with autism or any disability is like a preference assessment to kind of see, okay, well, what does this child like? What will they work for? What do they want to earn? What kind of environment do they like to work in? What kind of snacks do they like? And that's important information. And, even as a young child, there's ways that you can get them to participate in that so that you are not just making decisions for them, but they are showing you what they want. And that kind of gives them some of that autonomy. And as they grow and are able to participate more in different ways, they'll have more of a voice and opportunity to advocate for their wants and needs, which is, really what we want. So now we're going to kind of do a little virtual role play, walk in my shoes. So we're going to play a video and it'll be like a short demonstration for you to better understand sensory overload from the point of view of a student with autism. So, like I said, we'll show this short video and then after we'll have a little discussion and use the QR code to kind of reflect. So I'm going to play the video. Hopefully, this is heard from everybody. So sensory overload happens when there's too much information for your brain to take in all at once. So it's kind of causes slowdown. Um, this person says they start to feel it when they notice they're cranky for no reason. So make sure your volume's turned up so you can hear this. So that was some sensory overload. And I'll just pause the video right there. So before we jump into the Padlet, just kind of and before we talk as a to whoever, whatever groups y'all are joining in with at whatever schools, just think about some things like what sensations were overwhelming, what supports might help a student in this situation. So think about that and then discuss with, your team that you're joining in with on how this might shift your approach to delivering instruction and also your classroom setup. And then once you have taken a minute to talk with each other, you can scan the QR code and answer on Padlet, just the questions that are on the screen. So, what did this activity help you understand about student behavior, and how might this influence how you will support your students with ASD in your classroom? And then here's some examples I have from Padlet. So they will scan the QR code and um, answer on Padlet. All right, moving forward. All right, so some classroom success strategies that will be very helpful after we've, talked about the basics. These will be helpful for best supporting your students in your classroom. So visual schedules are extremely useful for your autistic students. A lot of them have a harder time processing information. So having that visual gives them a more grounded way to like recall information stored away in their brain or to even communicate what they're needing or wanting. So using visuals will give the child some predictability also, which can help alleviate some of the anxiety that they may have during the day. So these schedules, this is just one example. Um, they can be tailored to best fit the needs of your student. I've seen so many look so many different ways. Um, so it could be using words, pictures, or both. I've even seen schedules that are actual literal objects, and they have to, you know, see the physical, tangible object in order to understand what's going on, and what the schedule is telling them. So these can be very flexible, and you could even chunk it like the entire day if the student can handle that, or you may do half the day, or even just one task at a time, and not even just like not even just the block of time that they're in, but like literally specifically whatever work task they're doing. And you can have the steps for that work task even. And then once they complete that, then they get a new schedule with the new tasks. And um, touching base with your special education teachers at your school will really help you in order to figure out how to make those and what's going to work best for your student. And these can be free to very cheap to make. Like you don't necessarily have to go buy a whole program. There's tons of, resources online that are for free, but really a lot of times your special education teachers are going to be the ones to go to figure out what's going to work best for your student. Um, Now, something else that's going to be really important is to keep a structured routine. And that not only benefits like the rest of the kids in your classroom, but especially your kids with autism spectrum disorder. They really do well when they have that routine and that predictability. Again, like I said, with the schedule, the predictability can help alleviate some of their stress and anxiety. So keeping them on the routine gives them that feeling of security and helps keep them more calm. And then if anything in your routine does have to change, maybe you're going on a field trip or you're having an assembly. For some students, providing that advance notice of that change can actually help ease the transition rather than just throwing it at them, then that can cause a meltdown. So that's something else to keep in mind. Um, for sensory overload, there's different ways you can help minimize that for your students because it can happen very easily. And teachers should keep that in mind that it can happen easily for their kids with ASD. It could be caused by any number of things, really, such as maybe the volume of the talking in the classroom, um, maybe sudden loud sounds that may occur, like the bell ringing or maybe like a fire alarm, even like the texture of like objects or materials that they're exposed to in the classroom, um, and that they might need for like their assignments. So keeping tools in your classroom handy to help them like regulate themselves is going to be super important and very helpful for you. So those might be things such as noise canceling headphones or maybe like small desk appropriate fidgets. I know some fidgets turn into toys, so you want to be careful with those. Um, and even just like a quiet corner in your room where your student may know, okay, they can ask for a break. They go sit in the quiet corner, set a timer. When the timer's up, they come back, and maybe that can help them regulate themselves. Um, so those are just some options that you can use. Um, Next, we have social stories. So, social stories are brief, individualized stories that can help your students better understand maybe like classroom expectations or even to help prepare them for new situations. Like I've used them to prepare students who are going on a field trip and just explaining the field trip, setting the expectations for the field trip, and also to just give them advance notice. So that again goes back to that advance notice with scheduling. So you can use social stories for changes in your schedule. Um, and they can be printed, reused as often as needed. A lot of them can be edited to fit the needs of your student as well. And again, touch base with your special education teachers on your campuses to see what's going to be uh, beneficial and most useful for your specific students. Lastly, we'll just kind of touch on choices. So giving choices to your students whenever it's possible gives your students some autonomy in the classroom and kind of gives them some control. And it does not necessarily mean we're lowering expectations or just trying to give in to whatever they want, but giving them some control over their environment, like I said. So allowing them to choose between like an activity that they're going to do or maybe a workspace. Like, maybe you need them to do two separate worksheets and you let them choose which one to do first. That way you're not just saying, oh, well, we could play instead, because we don't really want them to play necessarily. We want them to do the two worksheets. We'll give them the choice. Say, okay, are we doing the writing worksheet first, or are we doing the sentence or the spelling worksheet first? And then that way they're still making a choice. It's giving them an autonomy and control, but they're doing what you want them to do. Um, so allowing them to choose between that or even rewards can help aid in reducing like problem behaviors. So this graphic is just an example of a choice board. So you may have some pre-selected choices that are appropriate for whatever you're doing, and they can say, well, I want this, or I'm working for Play-Doh, or I'm working for a puzzle, something that's appropriate for them and it's not going to, cause a big distraction. And they know first I do my work, then I do this. And that can help, like I said, reduce some of your problem behaviors. So, just some important takeaways that we'll go over because I know that there's quite a bit that we went over today. And again, I'm just so grateful for your participation and engagement. So, recap first, autism spectrum disorder is very diverse, and no two people are going to be exactly the same or present in the same way or have the same support needs. So, getting to know your students with autism spectrum disorder on an individual level is going to be the best way to ensure their success in school and in life. And then, secondly, really got to remember how important it is to collaborate, again, not only with professionals, with our students, but also the parents and the student. And when everyone's able to give their input into the planning, we create that, person-centered environment that focuses on the strengths and the needs of the student specifically, and then our students can thrive. So now would be a great time if anyone has any questions, or maybe if you'd like to share any past experiences with students with autism that you may have had. You can like use the raise hand button, or maybe even unmute yourself, or leave a comment in the chat. But pretty much we are done. So thank you so much, and I hope you have learned something valuable that you can use with your students with autism.